It's the week ending Saturday the 4th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen rioting in Zimbabwe following the country's first election without Mugabe, Donald Trump's former campaign manager on trial in the States, and a heist involving priceless Swedish jewels, a cathedral, and a speedboat. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie and Cameron Tait. And from the Week Junior, we welcome back Felicity Capon. And starting the show this week is Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week we learned that kink shaming is the last acceptable prejudice.
But Riggleman says there's a perfectly good explanation for him openly posting his homemade Bigfoot erotica. He says the posts were meant as a joke from his military buddies. Wait. You think that makes it sound better? We're just doing what all military buddies do. We're posting cryptozoological erotica in the middle of a congressional race. Hoorah!
Stephen Colbert, host of The Late Show on CBS, speaking earlier this week. And Rebecca, you are the first to bring Bigfoot erotica onto my podcast. Why?
Well, so the story this week is that there's a congressional race going on in Virginia, and the Democratic candidate, Leslie Coburn, posted a tweet about her rival, Republican Denver Riggleman, an aptly pornographic-sounding name.
Yeah, well, as is Coburn, if you say it as it's written.
That's true. And it was a picture of an Instagram post that he posted about a book he's working on, which is about Bigfoot. It's called The Mating Rituals of Bigfoot, Why Women Want Him. Uh-huh. And the cover art features a drawing of Bigfoot with a tastefully censored genital unit. And
then what happened next?
This was quickly circulated far beyond the Virginia political scene. But to me, the story about it is, and some people have brought this up as well, this was Motherboard on Vice have written about this. The weird thing is that in her tweet, she said he was caught on camera campaigning with a white supremacist. Now he has been exposed as a devotee of Bigfoot erotica. This is not what we need on Capitol Hill. So she basically equated those two things as equally unsuitable for office. And it kind of got me thinking that is... our sexual fetishes and kinks, the last taboo we have in politics. Obviously, there was time when being gay could have you disqualified from political office. People wouldn't vote for you based on that. Or being divorced, things like that used to be, really go against a candidate. We no longer accept that kind of prejudice, but we do still find it, acceptable to openly mock and denigrate people who are into slightly out there sexual pastimes.
Do you think it should be part of the political discourse, Cameron, what people are into sexually?
Well, no. What a politician is into has no effect on me whatsoever. It's not good to shame a kink, but it's a little bit obscure. If you look at the picture as well, it's just quite a crude drawing of a slightly hairy chap. And I also find it ever so slightly ironic that a liberal has picked this up. And surely the idea of being a liberal is that you're open to anything that makes somebody happy, and this isn't affecting anybody else. So it seems a little bit ridiculous in my eyes.
But do you understand, Felicity, why Republican voters, as you say, it's ironic, Cameron, that a Democrat picked this up because probably her voters wouldn't be as bothered. But do you understand why Republican voters might say, in the way they're used to about homosexual candidates, you're right, Rebecca, this means this isn't a family guy, therefore he doesn't represent me. The battle on homosexuality has been largely won. But, when it comes to kink, you can see that people say, I don't want to vote for someone who's not putting their family first. That's kind of where a lot of this prejudice comes from, isn't it?
Yeah, quite possibly. Although I'd say that the political climate in the US at the moment is such that it seems like you can get away with absolutely anything at the moment, whether it's criminal or just weird or obscure. It seems like, look at Trump, for example. I know the things he's accused of are way more serious, but his, if you really believe in Denver Riggleman and what he believes in, I don't think this is going to affect you the same way if you really, really a massive Trump supporter, he's got away with absolute murder. So I don't think that's maybe not going to be so relevant to voters.
Stuff does stick though, doesn't it? Once you've seen the image, I can imagine you're casting your vote on the... It is silly, but if I'm in that state and I'm casting my vote, I am thinking about the Bigfoot with the big willy as I'm casting my vote. But it's there now, isn't it?
I think it might have been... sort of crafty thing that Leslie Coburn did to sort of get more attention on this race, because now everyone's talking about it. And I wonder whether she brought it up so that it would turn the attention to the whole white supremacist allegations and get more sort of people talking about the serious substantive issues.
And it got me thinking as well about Andrew Griffiths, who was the Tory minister who recently resigned after it was revealed that he had sent over 2,000 explicit text messages to two barmaids who he'd met. And obviously, there is a core of actual misbehaviour here in that he is a married man. And although some people, would say that's not particularly relevant either to his, political position, you can understand why a lot of people would feel like that's not the kind of person that they would necessarily trust to represent them, because he obviously isn't loyal to his family, as the argument goes. But
that suggested an element of harassment as well, didn't it? It suggested an element of being possibly unwell. Like it wasn't just.
It was very
people
extreme.
would forgive half a dozen messages. It was thousands.
I'm not saying that he shouldn't have resigned, but if you look at the way the story was covered, particularly in the Sunday Mirror, it was a very have your cake and eat it too attitude, where they quoted very long excerpts from the text messages while talking about them being perverted. This is the kind of thing. It's not that his behaviour wasn't wrong, but it was wrong because it involved adultery and because it involved, misuse of power. But the way it was described in the Mirror as being perverted, that's kind of that they were talking about the content of the text, not the context in which they were sent. And I just think that you couldn't describe anything else that way than fetishes. It's still acceptable to call them perverted. Some of the texts the Mirror sniffily referred to as being too disgusting to print.
I find it quite funny because I've actually done some. I decided to do a little bit of research into this, and I looked up what some of the common kinks are. So, according to the Indie 100, they did a poll with 2,000 Redditors, and some of the most popular kinks include pretend rape, choking, and masochism. It kind of shows you there's a lot more going on in people's bedrooms than are made public, for obvious reasons. It's just this has happened to have come out.
No, but you've raised a really interesting point there. Would you be making the same point, Rebecca, if rather than a Bigfoot fetish, which by the way he's denied that he has, and he says it was just a joke anyway, but let's assume that a politician did have one.
A joke that he turned into 2 books.
Fine, okay. but rather than a Bigfoot fetish, which does seem relatively harmless, and people say, okay, you're not harming anyone else. If his thing was pretend rape or pretend paedophilia, right, you can still make the same argument. He's not doing anything. He's reading about it. He's fantasizing about it. He's thinking about it. His own thoughts are his own domain if he doesn't hurt anyone. But because the fantasies involve hurting someone, you could imagine voters would want to know about that.
Yeah, that's where it comes down. But I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that kinks and fetishes are still quite a taboo subject, despite the fact that, you can now read a lot more about them online and people are more open about them online than they were before. We still don't really understand that much about taboo kinks and how they work. A lot of people, of all the people who, as Cam was saying, rape fantasies are some of the most common types of porn, and all the people who watch them are obviously not wanting to do that in real life. But
do you see that it's a difficult position for a politician to defend?
Yes, but especially because people aren't empowered to come out and say, I enjoy watching rape fantasies, but that doesn't mean I'm a rapist or I want to be raped.
Felicity, is there a disconnect between what we kind of all know is on the internet and what we're allowed to say in public spaces?
Yeah, definitely. And I think with politicians, it's all the more so. I think we sort of half want to know that our politicians have some personality and some sort of character. And then when it goes too far, we don't want to know anymore. And I think the Bigfoot erotica it reminded me of Lemba Opek and the Cheeky Girls. It's not offensive or hurting anyone else. It's just a little bit, everyone sort of,
It's a cheeky giggle, isn't it?
It's a cheeky giggle, yeah. But then if you take it to the other extreme, Theresa May gets all the slack for seemingly not having any sort of personality or outside life or anything. The whole, what's the naughtiest thing you've ever done? Oh, I ran through a cornfield, and everyone groans because they say they want her to be able to connect with the electorate a bit more. So
she should have said writing Bigfoot erotica.
Yeah. She should have done, yeah. So it's a funny one because I think we're sort of half stuck between wanting our politicians to show a bit more lively, feisty, they're like us and we can relate to them. And then on the other hand, as soon as they say they've got a fetish for Bigfoot erotica, we're all absolutely appalled by it.
Maybe there's a middle ground because, running through fields of wheat and Bigfoot erotica are quite opposite ends of a spectrum, really, aren't they? If you just go into the middle, I'd be a little bit happier.
But do you think this is the shift, Rebecca, that we're now seeing? That actually these things get outed, people are still sort of experimenting with what is acceptable and what isn't to the public, but actually the reaction from the public has changed. I think back to Keith Vaz and the male prostitutes a few years ago as well. Also a Mirror story, wasn't it? actually, he's still got his job, hasn't he? He's an MP.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it doesn't really seem to have affected the public judgment of him.
Well, yeah, in fact, the public opinion does seem to have shifted to the point where the big consternation in liberal circles in the US over this Bigfoot erotica story is that so many progressive people leapt to his defense to say we shouldn't be shaming people for, what porn or erotica they choose to consume, which is then provoked a backlash of people saying you keep forgetting about the white supremacy, which is kind of the problem, is that the white supremacist thing has definitely been overshadowed.
And actually, the woman who tweeted it, the Democrat who's standing, I mean, she's made this false equivalence. She's really dug herself a grave here because she's made him seem kind of more cuddly and funny to a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And taken away the spotlight from white supremacy.
Yeah, but if you say white supremacist and Bigfoot erotica enthusiast, then you are going to remember the second half of that sentence more.
And I suppose the really troubling thing, if we zoom out enough over the last 4 years, is it's become part of political discourse in America to say, well, all right, I'm not a white supremacist, but I don't mind courting the votes of people who are.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just a kind of a microcosm of what's been going on in American politics in the Trump era, really. We're just distracted by the ridiculousness of everything.
Cameron, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Well, this week, the US citizens are all starting to worry about the rise of killer printers.
My partner, Ben Dinio, the guy who basically came up with the idea with me, we were on the phone and Ben was like, we could be like arms manufacturers. That'd be cool, right? And like, yeah, what about 3D printing, And at that point, we weren't aware that anyone had done it or was trying to. And I said, if we could print a gun, other people could do this. Like, what if we gave it away, open source style? What would that mean? And we realized, wow, this is really attractive.
Cody R. Wilson speaking to Vice for a documentary on his role in the rise of 3D printed guns.
So I think this story has been relatively underreported and the seriousness behind it. So yes, this story has come to a head this week, but it also spiked last week and also back in 2013. So this week, the US government has blocked the release of blueprints for 3D printed guns online. That comes a week after they legalised blueprints going online for 3D printed guns, after a 6-year battle to try and get them online.
And what's the argument? Because it seems very obvious that it's a bad idea.
I think the argument is obviously that Second Amendment right of being able to bear arms and everyone having a form of strong security at home. And that's really the only benefits I can think of. They're not particularly cheap to make. It really is a form of getting people guns nice and easily.
Which isn't an issue in the United States anyway, is it? I mean, as we've seen in all the massacres over recent years, anyone can basically walk into a supermarket and get a gun anyway.
Yes, but I think with 3D printing, people tend to have a relatively simplified idea of how it will work. Those kind of picturing themselves feeding the blueprint in and then kind of a sort of slightly steaming, perfectly formed AK-47 coming out at the other end. I mean, I say that, but I am no expert on the mechanics of 3D printing, but it does seem like it's actually quite difficult, and it isn't going to result in people just popping their blueprint
Cameron,
in the oven.
You are an expert on the mechanics of 3D printing. Enlighten us.
Yes, well, I was going to just dig a little deeper on that point to start off with. I think the obvious benefits of 3D printed guns is that everyone says it's their right to bear arms, but I also think it's the fetishizing of technology combined with arms. So how the process works, basically you download the blueprints of a 3D printed gun for free online. These guns include something called the Liberator, which is a short, stumpy little hand pistol, all the way to an AR-15, which is a semi-automatic rifle. Then you need to go and source the materials. Most of them are made of quite a tough plastic. And then you need to go to a 3D printer. You put the materials in, you put the blueprints in, and then after some time...
When you say go to a 3D printer, so is that like going to your local Kinko's or Staples or whatever?
You could. A lot of people like to invest in their own ones if they've got their own at home.
But it still costs thousands, doesn't it, at the moment?
Yeah. So the US police, they managed to print a 3D printed gun. The minimum they managed to find was a printer that was $1,700. So it still costs a lot of money just to be able to print one. Obviously, sourcing the plastics are going to be relatively cheap. So if you've got a 3D printer at home already, a 3D printed gun might be quite a cheap alternative to buying a metal killing machine.
But isn't the point that, as we see in technology all the time, costs come down year on year? So whilst Rebecca's saying, yeah, okay, the current situation is you've got a 4-figure sum and a pain and you don't, it's not as easy as people suggest. It might be in 5 years' time. It might be as easy as that.
The real problem here is 3D printed guns are blight on 3D printing. The technology, the price of it is coming down, and there are huge benefits. You can see a lot of it with people with, say, amputees, where they can go and get prosthetic arms. They can get them printed off much cheaper than if they went through a hospital. So obviously, if the price of 3D printers comes down and they become a household item, then we could start seeing this to be a lot bigger problem than it is at the moment.
These guns don't actually fire, though, do they? If you 3D print a gun, presumably it doesn't have a firing pin or any of the stuff that it actually takes to make a gun fire.
So you get the shell of the gun. They have actually said that you can make a firing pin not out of metal but out of plastic. Then obviously you need to go and buy ammunition. You can go and order ammunition online in America. It's like going to Amazon. And then you have yourself a fully functioning gun. If you've got a fully functioning gun that has a plastic firing pin, though, it'll only fire about 1 or 2 rounds before it blows up.
Okay, this is the most ludicrously ironic story ever. What exactly are we worried about here? That there are going to be plastic firearms flooding the market and no background checks, and there are going to be guns everywhere and people are going to die? Hello, the US already has that. I don't understand why this is. It just seems so ridiculous to me that it's not the 3D printers that are going to kill people. It's guns, which already are killing people in the US. Why is the US making such a song and dance out of this when they already, need to tackle the problem they have? Why are they so fussed about 3D printed guns all of a sudden?
I think the concern extends beyond America because we've got something that you can download. I actually tried accessing the website earlier today, and it's blocked at the moment, so you can't download any of it. But if it was online, technically here in England, we could go and download the same things, and obviously owning a gun here is illegal unless you've got a hunting license.
But presumably it's on the deep web anyway, if you know where to look for it in the places where people buy drugs and guns openly.
But it's kind of a bit like anything, really. I mean, if you had, let's say, a store that sold illegal drugs on the street, you'd find more people doing it because it's just easier to access. If you've got something that's online and it's technically legal somewhere, then you'll find more people going to go and buy it. I mean, do people really know how to access the dark web? I don't think it's quite a common thing, whereas people know how to type in an address in the address bar. So I think that's one of the major concerns. I wonder if also that it's that concern of maybe it'll be taking money away from registered gun suppliers in America.
The thing that sort of stands out to me about this story as well is that if we were talking earlier, like what if 3D printers do become more of a household item? But if we were living in a world where anyone could print anything out of their 3D printer, like surely the firearms thing is quite a minor issue compared to the fact that what kind of impact would that have on our economy? If you could anything you have that you own now that could be made out of plastic, if you could make that at home, like surely that would destroy like countless industries, like far beyond affecting the firearms industry.
But presumably some of the blueprints, if you were buying a replacement loo roll holder from Andrax or whatever, would be patented. You'd be paying for the blueprint.
You don't need a special one, do you? Because people would just put free ones online. You could make anything.
But that's branding generally, isn't it? And we already have an economy where you can get cheap versions of everything, but people like to spend money on the stuff they think's better.
But if you think of all the stuff now that we buy that's made of plastic, like if we could just make that ourselves at home for the cost price, like, wouldn't that have a far more wide-reaching impact?
Yeah, much more of a wide-ranging impact than everyone killing each other with guns, Cameron. Why didn't we talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the typical thing, really, of something so dangerous really sparking a greater debate when it comes to consumerism. Could it happen? Of course, I think people have tried making their own toys at home with 3D printing. Again, 3D printing really is very much in its infancy still, so there's not a lot of people doing it. But I mean, it would be really hard for copyright laws to catch up on, because if you, like you said, a loo roll holder, if you wanted to make one for yourself at home, then, I mean, who's really going to care? I guess it's like making a copy of a CD that you're just going to play in the car. As long as you're not distributing it, it's fine.
Well, so that's a crucial distinction, isn't it? Because it almost comes back to the debate we had in the 80s about people taping the radio on cassettes and, what the music industry should do. And basically, the conclusion was, well, it is sort of illegal, but if it's for someone's personal use, we're never going to prosecute them because that's fine. The problem is if they start distributing cassettes and charging people for them. Isn't that sort of the case, even with guns? Like, guns are legal in the US. There are already laws that say you can't buy an untraceable gun. A lot of the concerns around plastic guns is that they wouldn't be traceable by the police. So you're breaking the law by using one. But if you print one at home, what's really for your own use and you don't use it, you're not breaking the law. So what's the problem?
I think we're going to have to, it'll have to wait to the unfortunate day where we see the first 3D printed gun massacre. This is when we're going to have to confront that kind of reality. But I think, a lot of the concern in the US comes from the fact, kind of ironically seeing as, it's a very kind of anti-government culture in general. is the concern that guns are going to be completely decentralized, that there would be no registry of these weapons. Anyone could print as many as they wanted. And now, of course, there's like also the constant fear of terrorism is, at the forefront of everyone's mind. You could have a terror cell making dozens of unregistered firearms that couldn't be detected by airports, security scanners. Like, it's just, there's a lot of points in this story that kind of calculated to specifically stoke certain fears, I think.
Yeah, and I don't want to be that conspiracy guy, but I guess the real problem is when it comes to aeroplanes, because if you've got a gun that's made of plastic and you walk through a metal detector, obviously it's not going to go off. Now, obviously, a completely plastic gun you're not going to get much out of it because it will blow up after a couple of rounds, but that's still probably enough to down a plane. It sounds horrible, but I mean, it's certainly possible. Those are the biggest concerns, in my opinion.
Yeah, you wouldn't bet against it, would you? And that is the horrible truth. Felicity, you are our last contributor this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are Pakistan's finances at a sticky wicket?
Inshallah, corruption.
I promise that I will control the corruption. I will prove that we can have such a government here too, where our ministers will be scared of engaging in corruption, as our National Accountability Bureau will prosecute anyone, including Prime Minister and ministers, as it happens in the West.
Imran Khan, Pakistan's new Prime Minister, of course, if he can form a coalition, that is. Felicity, he was big news at the start of the week, then we all started looking at Zimbabwe's elections instead. Why do you want to bring us back to Pakistan?
Yes, well, I think there's a story going on in Pakistan which isn't necessarily about Imran Khan's election, and that is its economy is in a really, really bad way. There's no money in the coffers, and it looks as though Imran Khan is imminently about to go to the IMF to seek a huge bailout of about $12 billion. Which is a big, big story. It has lots of implications because Imran Khan has made a lot of promises when he was campaigning to be Prime Minister. Imran Khan wants to implement an Islamic welfare state. He wants to upgrade education. He wants to expand a social safety net. So he's got lots of really
Doesn't sound cheap.
I know, exactly. It doesn't sound cheap. He's got lots of really, really big ideas. That is part of the reason why he was voted in. Because the finances are in such dire straits, it looks like the IMF will have to bail him out.
Give us a context on dire straits.
So foreign currency reserves have dried up. They've only got $9 billion worth of reserves left. That's enough to cover imports for the next 2 months only. And that's because higher oil prices have pushed up the cost of imports. Exports aren't doing so well.
Okay, granted, doesn't look good. It's the country's 13th bailout by the IMF, I think. But, he says, possibly contentiously, that's what the IMF's for, isn't it? That's what it's designed for, isn't it? To help developing countries out of problems where they don't have a supply of money so that they can compete on an international basis. That's why it exists.
It is, but guess who's not a fan of this huge bailout? It's the US. So the US has waded into the story because they are big funders of the IMF, and Mike Pompeo has said that he is in two minds, to put it lightly, as to whether he would want an IMF bailout, because China has lent Pakistan an awful lot of money for various infrastructure projects. And if the IMF bail Pakistan out, that money is basically going to write off a lot of Chinese loans. And Mike Pompeo, and I'm sure a lot of US taxpayers, aren't particularly happy about that. So it's a wider sort of, the struggle between Washington and Beijing is also being fought out over this country in this election, I suppose. Also.
And Cameron, there's also this subtext of China having loaned so much money to Pakistan over the years that actually this is about Chinese influence infiltrating China versus the US, because if they get this money from the IMF, they might end up giving quite a lot of it back to China.
Yeah, I've also, having a look into it, it seems like this is quite a common practice for China to do with smaller countries around it to gain its influence, is to give loans. To me, it just seems like it would be shifting the debt from one country to the other, would it not?
But then the kind of the crux of the issue is if Pakistan doesn't get an IMF bailout, the most likely alternative is that it will go to China for yet more loans from China. Immediately after Khan's election, China immediately offered to loan them $2 billion extra dollars, and they will probably go cap in hand for a bit more money if they don't get it from the IMF. So really, the US is at a bit of an impasse, because if they do try and block this IMF loan, it's probably just going to push Pakistan further in China's direction. They're working on this massive project called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is this big project to strengthen transport links, economic links between China and Pakistan. And Pakistan has said that they are committed to seeing that project through. So it does seem like they are drifting closer into Chinese influence, which, is not welcome news to the US. But Trump they've cut aid to Pakistan. And so they haven't really they haven't really done anything for Pakistan, so you can see why the idea of Chinese investment is very attractive to a financially ailing country.
And I think it's also got implications for the US-Pakistan relationship too, because that's always been sort of historically quite fraught over counter-terrorism and what Pakistan is doing in terms of counter-terror measurements not doing, exactly, with Afghanistan. So I think, as Rebecca says, if the IMF bailout doesn't happen and Pakistan is pushed further to China, and you see a worsening of relationship between the US and Pakistan, that's not good for all sorts of reasons.
And what's the real politique for Khan then? Because, as I said, he's trying to form a coalition government at the moment. If this all comes to a head in the next few weeks and it appears that he's going to be struggling to get this money from anyone, what does that mean for him? It sort of seems to me that he's been a popular elected leader, so it's almost like whatever government they end up with, he's going to be leading it, but he might not be delivering on any of the promises he stood for.
I think that's the problem, and I think a lot of analysts and experts are sort of saying it's going to be really dicey waters ahead for him, because he has made all these campaign promises. He wants to go after corruption in a big way. He wants to implement this welfare state, and I think the minute he gets this IMF bailout, there are going to be really stringent conditions that come with that bailout. That means he can't do these things, and I wonder at that point whether, and I think Pakistan's history of democracy and exchanging power democratically isn't good. The military holds huge power. There's been a number of coups in the past, so I think it could be potentially quite dicey.
Just to pick up on what you're saying about the conditions, this is one of the major issues as well, is that IMF bailouts do come with strings attached, and they may well prevent, they're not going to bail him out so he can, implement this massive program of welfare reforms that will make his government really popular, because, that's not what the money would be intended for. That's another thing that makes China so attractive, is that their money doesn't come with those kinds of strings attached. They are primarily interested in building up an economic relationship and increasing their sphere of influence. They are not interested in forcing Pakistan to do, certain counter-terror measures. They're not interested in things like democracy, which, yes, it's a bit naive to say that the US and the West generally is, just all about pushing democracy, but they do at least tend to pay lip service to the idea of, well, you need to, if we're going to work with you, if we're going to provide you with aid, there needs to be progress on things like human rights and democracy, counter-terrorism. China's really just focused on the economic relationship. So for countries like Pakistan, it does make more cooperation with them make sense, really.
But surely if China's just going to give them an extra loan, again, Khan's idea is to push for a welfare state. What do they get back from that?
Well, yeah, but it's sort of turning into a bit of a Cold War scenario now with China in the Russia role, because we've seen China's pouring tons of investment, not just in Pakistan, but also in Africa. They've been pouring in money, again, sort of bypassing that Western route of, we want these kinds of democratic changes, blah, blah, blah. China's just been pouring money in left, right and centre, and they've really got a lot of money to do that with. So they are building up a massive sphere of influence, and I think the US is probably right to be worried.
And Felicity, we contribute to the IMF as well, obviously. What do you think the reaction here would be? It has been slightly underreported in Britain thus far. What do you think the reaction here would be if the IMF gives yet more money to Pakistan? They are one of those sort of hot button countries, aren't they? When you talk about foreign aid, for example, it always comes up in the phone-ins, doesn't it? Why are we giving money to a country that's got its own space program, etc.? And
I think it has been hugely underreported, but it does affect us because we do contribute to the IMF. But I don't know, I wonder whether there are parallels to Greece and the IMF with Greece and the whole Brexit, what's going on at the moment. I think there'd probably be a lot of naysayers in this country who don't want to see their money going to the IMF and bailing out countries. So I think it would probably have a negative reaction. On a side note, I just wonder, going back to the US, I wonder what Donald Trump and Imran Khan would make of each other, because there has been at some comment in the press that they're not actually that dissimilar, and that Imran Khan, the world famous cricket captain of Pakistan and the sort of playboy, and I just think it'd be really interesting to see what relationship they form and whether that has any impact on their relations going forward.
Yeah, the political outsiders who are actually both massive establishment figures.
Yeah, interesting.
And more importantly, whether either of them are into Bigfoot porn.
Well, yes.
Watch this space. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity Capon, Rebecca Gillie and Cameron Tait. Tell us what you think of the show or any of the stories we've covered today. We are at Week Unwrapped on Twitter, or you can write us a review on Apple Podcasts, which really helps other people discover the show. Stay subscribed to hear our next edition of Business Unwrapped as well. That's our series of bonus shows brought to you by our friends at Barclays Corporate Banking, and you can get them all delivered straight to your phone when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped for free on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, Bye-bye.